welcome to another episode of the Comeback Coach podcast. I'm your host, Mike Searle. Before I introduce our exciting guest, what's the first thing that comes to mind when I ask you the following question? Who have you got on your list of friends who would willingly take your call at 3 a.m. one morning because you're wide awake with a problem stuck on your mind? Jeff Madoff discusses what he calls his 3 a.m. friend list, the people who he could call in such a situation, and the value of having such a friends list. Jeff Madoff is the founder of Madoff Productions based in New York City. His company collaborates with ad agencies, public relations firms, and directly with clients, produce commercials, corporate branding films, live streaming events, and branded content. Jeff began his career as a fashion designer. He was chosen one of the top designers in the US and switched careers to film and video production. He's produced and directed award-winning commercials, documentaries and web content around the world for clients such as Ralph Lauren, Victoria's Secret, Radio City Music Hall, the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, and Harvard University. He's written and is producing a play based on the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame legend Lloyd Price. Its world premiere will be in May 2022. And his book, Creative Careers, Making a Living with Your Ideas, was published in 2020. Listening closely now because Jeff is going to tell us what life has taught him about getting back on track in tough times. Let's join Jeff Madoff right now.
Well, it really is a pleasure to have Jeff Madoff on the show and to introduce him to you, the audience of this podcast. Jeff, welcome.
Well, thank you, Micah. Thanks for having me on.
Now, what an interesting guy with such a rather diverse background and a double major in philosophy and psychology. I want to come to that. And someone who's made a stamp on creativity and the use of creativity in so many different ways, but in creation of, in the advertising and marketing world, creating commercials, web content, music videos, documentaries, for some of the biggest brand names, Ralph Lauren and Victoria's Secret, just to name a few. We're going to come to that. I've got a few interesting quotes that I've pulled from you, which I'd like to have you expand on and explain to our listeners what that is all about. But let's just come back, before we get onto all of it, let's just come back to Jeffrey Madoff. Jeff in New York. So were you introduced to the world in New York? Is that where you grew up?
No. And thanks, it's such a nice introduction that I hate to disappoint your listeners by screwing up the wonderful first impression you've created. So thank you very much. I was born in Akron, Ohio. And back then it was the rubber capital of the United States. All the major rubber companies were there. And I remember as a kid, depending on the way the wind was blowing, you had the unpleasure of smelling what rubber being rendered smelled like. And, my dad had a store downtown in Akron. So when I'd go and visit my dad at the store, it was like, wow, bad. But it was an, interesting place. Maybe that's why I'm so bouncy and resilient.
Bouncy and resilient. Wow. Talk about segueing perfectly. Yeah. Okay. So brothers, sisters?
Yes. I have one sister, older than I, an entrepreneur, has her own fashion business in Charleston, South Carolina. And, Janice, like myself, just started her own business. And my parents, mom and dad, were entrepreneurs. So, I grew up in that climate, and I'm an entrepreneur because I'm probably unhirable. So my alternative was to start my own company or companies.
Well, you've certainly done that, and how. I see, I can quote you, I'm an entrepreneur because I'm unemployable.
Yeah, that's, I don't know if that's anything to brag about, but yeah, I've always sort of had my own direction, as did my parents and my sister. So Maybe it's genetic. I don't know, but we all sort of went that direction.
What store did your father have, by the way?
So my parents had retail clothing stores for kids and women.
Right. So, all of the dots are starting to join up here. So mum and dad, parents, a store in fashion, the business entrepreneurial gene has been planted inside of Jeff right from the word go. And your older sister is a entrepreneur. And did you say she's also in fashion?
Yes.
Okay. So when did you move to New York?
Well, there was a stop before New York, and that's when I got my major in philosophy and psychology. I went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison, which was a great place to go to school. And that's where I started my first business, which was the fashion business in doing design.
Well, there's humility there because you were regarded in the top 10 fashion designers of the world, or New York, or
the United States.
In the United States.
That sounds much more impressive than it is, Mike. I think I was one of the top 10 young designers in the United States, and I think there were only like 7 or 8 of us. So to be in the top 10 wasn't that big a deal. It was a big national press show at the Plaza Hotel, which was the hotel at that time. And, I got a lot of press from it, and that was all good. But, at that time, and we're talking about the early 70s now, young people weren't starting businesses. Startups weren't a thing. Yeah. And it was actually pretty hard starting a business as a young person, because the established fabric companies, the established contractors who made the clothing, didn't want anything to do with what they considered to be a kid. And it wasn't until they saw the size of the orders that I was coming in with that it got their attention.
Right. It's interesting. So here's a guy who's graduated from the University of Wisconsin in Madison with a double major in philosophy and psychology, which my way of thinking, more left-brained types of thinking activities. And you actually have a section in your book, Creative Careers, Making a Living with Your Ideas, which was published only last year. And that book, by the way, for our listeners, Jeff, is your course that you've been teaching at Parsons School of Design since 2007, Creative Careers, Making a Living with Your Ideas. So is that course and all of the experience of teaching, I would say hundreds, thousands of students into the book form, pushed into the book form. In that book, you actually have a part in the book with a subheadline that which infers that there is no left brain, right brain. I'm thinking philosophy and psychology. I'm thinking semi-bald, bearded, very, and creativity. I mean, there's fashion design, and you've made this whole. You still do. You've got this big company employing, I think, these days, lots of people involved in creativity. So where do you go? How did you go from philosophy and psychology, or majoring, into fashion design?
Well, I tried to get a job as a sage, but the wisdom factories weren't hiring. And I was working in a small boutique in Madison, and I was the buyer for that store. And I got a phone call from a dear friend of mine, lifelong friend. His mom and my mom grew up together. And, Kenny Meerman's his name. And Kenny called me up. He had graduated from college a year before I. And he said, listen, I've got some money saved up. Can you think of a gig that would earn more than bank interest? And I was at work in the store. And I said, well, I see what we sell and I could always draw. I'll start a clothing company. He said, okay. And then memory is foggy as to how much he actually sent me. We aren't really sure, but I'll take the high end of it. And it was more money than I ever had at one time. So hold on to your seat, Mike. $2,500. And, I had no idea if that was a lot or a little. It turned out to be very little. But I think that's one of the benefits of youth and ignorance is you can have that kind of ambition. And if you knew better, you would have never undertaken the challenge. And I didn't know any better. I was very ignorant. Fortunately, I wasn't stupid. And the difference is ignorance you can learn, stupid's forever.
Yeah.
So I was able to learn, and it's a tough but great way to learn by actually doing.
Yeah.
Now, I wouldn't, by the way, suggest that you do that if you're going to have surgery. You want to go to a doctor who has actually learned how to do all these procedures. But in business, I think that you can be a little riskier, and nobody's going to lose their life over it.
Okay, that explains it well then. Somewhat serendipitous then, and it led to this very successful career that you've made by using your creativity and by making your own living using your own ideas. Can we just side note here, because our listeners and our viewers, pardon me, watching this on YouTube would see pictures on the wall behind you, and we can't help it. I know everybody will be looking at it. A picture of what looks like Elvis Presley. Is that right?
It is right.
What's the story behind that? Why have you got that on your wall? And who's with Elvis there?
That's an actress, and her last name was Hart. I don't remember her first name, but she's the one. The story came out just a few years ago that she co-starred with Elvis, I think, in 2 movies, and she became a nun. So that was an interesting thing. That's
a different twist on starring with Elvis.
Yes. Enough of this. I'm going to devote my life to the church.
I've reached my ultimatum. I'm off now.
Yes. I was in San Francisco. It was probably close to 10 years ago or so. And I saw this artist, and he was using a single bristle brush and graphite powder. And he was doing this amazing drawing. And it looked like a photograph. His technique was so amazing. And I said, when is that going to be finished that you were working on? And he said, it's probably going to take me another few weeks. And do you have any other work that's done? And he showed me what he had, the Elvis picture being one of them. And it's not that I'm a big Elvis fan, but I loved the technique, and I just loved his work. And the funny thing is, it's ended up being quite the conversation piece, because, of course, everybody recognizes Elvis. Oh, you're a big fan of Elvis? Not really, but I'm a big fan of this artist's work, and this was a great display of his technique.
You would have appreciated that, because you said that back in the earlier days that you knew you could draw, which is important for fashion designers, is it not?
Well, yes and no. One of my clients for 35 years or so is Ralph Lauren. Mm-hmm. Ralph can't draw, so he's never drawn anything. But the point is that you don't have to know how to draw, but you have to have somebody around you who can.
Right.
And so he though had such great taste, and he would react to the images, and so Ralph would have the artist sketch and then modify the drawings. You want to see a higher peak on the lapel or a softer shoulder or whatever. And so he didn't really need to know how to draw. It's helpful if you do, but it certainly didn't hinder him. So he didn't have to know how to draw, and he built a multi-billion-dollar global company.
The fashion designer with a pen or pencil in hand, given the task to design something for us, Jeff, did you ever have blank screen, like the equivalent of writer's block?
When I was designing my own line?
Yeah.
Once I landed on a theme for a collection, then that was the hardest part. What did I want what story did I want it to tell? And it was always, to me, about a certain narrative, long before the term storytelling has become sort of a flag that's planted now with everything.
Yeah.
And so once I hit that point, then I was able to, not have block. I could keep going because I had my theme, and then it was relatively easy. The funny thing is, Mike, that early on, when I was first starting, I sent out some sketches and fabric to get them costed at a contractor in Georgia. I get back the sample with the swatch of the fabric I sent at a pretty high price. And I was surprised by the price. It had my wholesale price on there, which my wholesale prices weren't that high. Well, it was from Ralph Lauren, and we were both at the same factory, and our work was similar. And that, the kind of things that I did and the kind of things that he did. And it was just kind of funny that then some years later, I ended up working with Ralph. And the thing is, we immediately had a rapport because I totally understood his approach to design and how he designed what he designed. And by the way, I could draw, but I could draw cartoons and stuff. I couldn't do anything like that picture of Elvis, nor could I do really good fashion drawings, although I could sort of start it off, but I wasn't a fashion illustrator or a fashion artist. But the narrative quality, which has been the through line in all of my work, switching over to production and doing commercials and documentaries, writing a book, the play that I wrote and is being produced, there is a through line there. And this may be jumping ahead, but to me, what's really interesting is that I learned that designing a line of clothing, and I mentioned having a narrative to it. Well, when you're making that into a business, so you have the clothes, well, you need to know, what are the materials? How much do they cost? What's the labor? How much is that going to cost? What's it cost to ship the stuff? I need it delivered by a certain time so I can then repackage it, send it off to the stores that bought from me, charge them enough that I'm making a profit for it, and I have to collect the money. Same thing. I had an idea for a film or a commercial or some what they now call branded content. I had to actualize that idea, cost out the labor, cost out the materials, cost out all of those things, have a deadline, submit the bill, and get paid. So the process was very much the same. And I think a lot of times people who feel stuck think that they can only do a very narrow path. And you don't realize that the protocols of most businesses are more alike than they are different. And I've learned that everything that I've done, although it may sound very disparate, actually are very similar. And most businesses are very similar. So you shouldn't become intimidated by the language and the lingo, and really look at, well, what are the processes? And the processes are coming up with an idea, being able to communicate that idea through a sketch, verbally, whatever, and communicating that idea to others so that you can work together in concert in order to create the final product to sell. And that, by the way, hits on another really important business aspect, if you'd like, and that is proof of concept. When I started my first company, the clothing company, when I sketched up some designs, and then some of the women that worked at the clothing store were freelancers, but they were like seamstresses to shorten pants and do alterations. And I got them to make the samples. We put them in the store and they sold out right away. So they made some more, they sold out right away. So then I had them put together a whole line for me, strapped them on the back of my motorcycle, drove to Chicago, went to 18 stores, sold 14 of them. And what I had, even though I didn't know it was called this at the time, was a proof of concept, because people were willing to buy what I was creating. And that's a critical notion when you're trying to gain traction as a creative person in your business. And that proof of concept is crucial. And the key operative term, when you say proof of concept, I'll put it in a different way. You can't be the only one in love with your idea if you hope to make a business out of it. People have to be willing to pay for that product or service in order for you to build a business out of it. So you have to put it out there and really see that it's something that people want.
Testing for proof of concept.
Yes.
Vitally important. Well, obviously your proof of concept was well proven throughout your career. And I didn't mention, and you did bring it up, so forgive me, that this must be incredibly exciting to have a play. So you're a playwright, so you've written a play, which I believe was intended to play on the stage to an audience this year, but it's been put back to next year. Is that right?
That's right. I love the fact that you really did your homework, Mike. I really respect that. And thank you. Yeah, actually, we would have been completing our run last weekend. But back in September, I was really concerned that we would not be out of COVID and that people would not be returning to live theater or live venues at this point. So I talked to my management, who then negotiated with the theater, who has a lot invested in the play also, and they want it to be successful. And I wanted to move it to first quarter of 22 when I felt we would be sufficiently out of it that we could mount the production. And so, I mean, it takes a long time to mount a play. And on one hand, the last thing I wanted to do was add another year to the process. But on the other hand, even less so, I didn't want us to fail. I wanted to set it up because it's hard enough. So if I would have kept that slot and we couldn't have performed, it could have been 2 or 3 years before we'd have gotten another time slot. So I took a certain gamble, and fortunately, it seems to have worked out.
Oh, exciting for you, for your family, for the people that you mix with, your friends, your followers. To see a Jeffrey Madoff playwright play live, being acted out on stage. What about the future? Is there going to be a screenplay? Are you going to write a movie? Well, look, kind of makes sense because you are so involved in high production video content for example, Victoria's Secret video productions and commercials and other web content. Do you think down the track that might happen? Is that a vision you have for yourself?
Well, yeah, I have written a screenplay. And actually, I switched gears to devote the time and the initial monies that I raised for the screenplay to this theatrical play about Lloyd Price, because Lloyd Price, the play is called Personality, the Lloyd Price musical. Lloyd Price is a rock and roll Hall of Fame legend. And back in 1952, with his first song, Lawdy Miss Clawdy, he broke down the wall that was called race records. Because back then, if you wanted to buy a record by a black artist, you had to go to a black record store. But nobody was prejudiced against Green. And he was the first teenager to sell over 1 million records.
Right.
And so, yeah. So his life was amazing. He not only broke down that wall, he was the first musician of any color to start his own label. So he was an entrepreneur. And he was the first black man to open up a nightclub below Harlem. So that was a big deal too. So his life is fascinating. Yeah. His music is great. And it all takes place at the crossroads of the youth movement, the civil rights movement, and the birth of rock and roll. So all the story elements are there. And I've had the good fortune of becoming very close friends with Lloyd and spending a lot of time with him.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, you know, the source material is firsthand from the source. And then I also fact checked everything to make sure, because we wanted to tell a real story.
How did that, excuse me for interrupting. So how did that conversation with Lloyd go with you and him? Did you say, Lloyd, I want to put your story onto the stage or onto a screenplay?
Well, there was a critical step before that. And that was, I was approached. I had done a film for the 75th anniversary of Radio City Music Hall. So my film was part of the Christmas Spectacular. And the executive producer of Radio City really liked my work. We got on well, established a good friendship. He left Radio City and he gave me a call and he said, there's somebody I want you to meet. And I said, sure, I'll meet anybody you want me to meet. Who is it? He said, well, do you know who Lloyd Price is? I said, oh, yeah, because you've got walk a personality, talk a personality. He goes, yeah, and he laughs. That's right. That's Lloyd. And he said, yeah, there's something here. And I'd like you to meet him. So we met, we hit it off. And what they wanted me to do is put together a short documentary that they could use as a pitch piece to tell Lloyd's story. So I researched him and did an interview with him and made this documentary, which he really loved. I so loved his story and he was so charismatic that I said to him, Lloyd, I know I can capture your voice. I want to tell your story. And I wrote the first few scenes and he loved what I wrote. And so from there, we just started working together. So that's, you know, most things happen, that kind of serendipity. You never really know.
Yeah. Isn't that so true?
Well, it is. And I think another thing, you know, for your listeners, it's really important is to be opportunity focused and then take action.
Yeah.
So I knew that I loved Lloyd's story. I knew that he was a charismatic person. I knew that there was a great story to tell there. But if I didn't do anything, nothing would happen. So I told him, I want to do your story. And you have to put yourself out there. And like something that I do with my students the first day of class every semester is I say, how many of you have been into a gallery and you think, oh, I could have done that? Of course, everybody's hand goes up. I said, so what's the difference between them and you? And there's silence. And then somebody lights up and says, they actually did it. I said, that's right. They actually did it. And so those who feel stuck, those who feel that they don't have any opportunities, you have to create opportunities. Things don't drop in your lap.
Yeah.
And so you also have to understand and be able to recognize opportunities, because if you don't recognize them, obviously you can't take advantage and capitalize on them.
Right.
So having that antenna up is so important. And then if you think it's cool, go for it, because you never know where that's going to take you.
The profundity in the simplicity of it all is really interesting. And those on the surface, simplistic kinds of questions you ask your students on first day of first semester are as deep as you want to go. And it just really just dovetails perfectly into somebody who is watching you or listening to you as a guest on this podcast now, who is in a position of adversity or recently. And so, by the way, I had to look that word adversity up. I wanted to really know what that meant. I mean, I've experienced it myself, and I think somebody, I think it was Joe Vitale, an author, said everybody goes through something at some time. So we've all got that story. We've all got that story. I'm sure you've had some setbacks and suffering in your life, Jeff. Everybody has a story. And to be in that position, some people don't have the radar up. This conversation we're having, Jeff, could be the catalyst for somebody to raise their antenna and to realise that there is an opportunity that they've been seeing but been ignoring, or haven't been seeing because they've been blinded because of some reason. This could be the catalyst for somebody taking the next step. So let's talk about that a little bit. Let me ask you personally, has it all been beer and Skittles for Jeff Madoff?
Oh, yes. I've never had any friction in my life. It's gone as smooth as silk. Everything I've done has been staggeringly successful. And, you don't get to a certain age without having battle scars. And I got some of my battle scars quite young. And, things that I could not have been prepared for. And for instance, in my clothing company, I employed about 120 people.
Right.
And, I started the company when I was 21. And, by the time I was 22, I had that many people who were growing that quickly. And I had no background in that. I knew how to treat people well because I saw how my parents dealt with the people who worked for them. And, you treat people with respect. You honor their contribution. You acknowledge their contribution. And, you don't have a lot of turnover as a result. And creating that environment is really important. But at a certain point, there was a recession happening. And this was like in 1973 or so. And I had to lay off a lot of people. I'd never had to do that before because I was only growing. And so I had to do that. Now, I'm a kid. And the people that I had to lay off, most of them were twice my age or more. They had families. And, I realized this is really significant. And this is a significant blow to them, as it was to me. But I was aware of the responsibility that I accepted. A lot of people, well, it's not your responsibility. Well, it is my responsibility. I gave them a job. I built up a business, and then I had to let them go. And that's the first time I ever had to deal with something like that. And, having the empathy for the struggle that they're going through made that harder for me to do. Mm-hmm. But I have no regrets about having those feelings. It's not just business. I believe you have to respect the people that you work with. Now, of course, that means you hire respectable people, and sometimes you don't. But the point being, that was huge for me, and that was a huge learning experience for me. But my learning experiences started, younger than that. But that was a big deal when I realized that I was impacting a significant number of adults who depended on that income.
So when you were lying in bed you being in your early 20s, employing some 100 odd people, and the downturn in the economy in the 1970s happened, and you realized that you had no choice but to lay people off, what went through your mind when you're laying in bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, wide awake, contemplating this? What thoughts were going through your head?
Various things. It was hard to get out of bed in the morning.
Yeah.
Because I knew what I'd be facing that day.
Right.
And so it was really difficult. Plus, we're going after major stores in the United States that normally paid in like 30 to 45 days. We're taking 3 months to pay, 4 months to pay. And so there was nothing pleasant. I was chasing money, and I was having to lay people off, and I still had to keep designing, and still keeping new product coming out.
Creativity juices flowing in the positive.
That's right. So it was really hard. I never doubted that I would somehow get through this. Now, but getting through it could take many different shapes. Getting through it could mean shutting down the business. I was young enough, I had the perspective enough to know that worst comes to worst, I can shut down the business. I have a good reputation. I can start anew if it comes down to that. But it was more the day-to-day, knowing what I was facing each day, where in the grander scale, when I was able to just gain some perspective, which came a few different ways. I mean, just the learnings that happened from people that I had met, but also having strong relationships. I mentioned to you my friend who gave me the money to start the company. We're still dear friends. And, I am fortunate that I have many very dear friends that I'm in regular contact with since my childhood. And I believe that the real currency in life is the integrity of the relationships that you have and maintain.
Love it.
So I call them those 3 a.m. friends.
Yeah. That
I could call up, and even if it was just an empathic ear,
yes,
I could talk to, that made a big difference.
I love that, Jeff. I love that. That is so important. And from my own experience, that is so right. Currency in life is the quality of the relationships. And it's testament to you as a person that somebody who was a friend back in the 70s is still a friend of yours today, and the friendship is as strong as it was back then, if not stronger. Something you mentioned during telling that part of your story, some mornings were hard. You found it hard to get out of bed. Now I can relate to that from my past story, and so many people will relate to that. And there's a copywriter, Gary Halbert, direct response copywriter since past, and he said emotion beats meditation. And sometimes in that, if we use that as a metaphor, hard to get out of bed in the morning, it's not just only a metaphor, it's straight out fact. Some mornings are bloody friggin' hard to get up. Yes. You don't want to get your feet on the floor. You'd rather pull the blankets over, the covers over your head, and just wish that it was still midnight and everybody else was still asleep and it was still dark. Oh, my goodness, the sun's up. I've got to get up. Sometimes you've just got to swing those feet up over the side of the bed and put your feet on the floor and put one step in front of the other and keep moving. And you obviously did that. And now look, and I want to just make this point, because here's Jeff Madoff today in 2021 sharing with us a story of adversity, setback, suffering for him and for his staff, those who had to be let go. He's sharing this story today in a reflection. So it's a retrospective. It's a reflection back. Shit passed, okay? This too shall pass. We hear this advice so often, no matter what the situation is. Even though it cannot be believed that this this too shall pass. This too will pass if you will let time do its thing. And here we are in 2021, and you've shared that story. Thank you. Jeff, I want to quote you on, because I, in preparing for our conversation today, I was thinking from your point of view, and I'm thinking from the listener's point of view, and the listeners who are in that situation where they're looking for a spark of encouragement, inspiration, creativity. So when the world of Jeff Madoff came into my world, and so what's this guy about? Creativity. That's the word that kept on. Okay, so to me, Jeff Madoff is creativity, and I thought, right. So the listener and the viewer of this podcast, what can they learn from this guy who is about creativity? And I want to just quote you. You were asked on a previous interview, what is creativity? And your definition at that time was the ability to see the relationship between ideas and the ability to create something new. Now, when somebody's stuck, they feel they're stuck in a rut, they feel they can't get out. How is the ability to see the relationship between ideas and the ability to create something new significant for them in that situation, please, Jeff?
Well, I'll give you a two-part answer. The reason it's significant is because it allows you to see the opportunities we were talking about.
Yeah.
So how do you get that opportunity antenna up so you're getting those signals out there? And the way that you do that is, there's a myth about creativity that somehow these ideas come fully formed in a lightning bolt of inspiration. Well, that's not how your brain works. That's not how things happen. But what does happen is the more things that you experience, and what do I mean by that? There's, of course, life experience that we all have in relationships and difficulties and whatever. But there's also reading books, going to theater, going to movies, going to conferences, having your ideas challenged by others, putting yourself out there, realizing that the risk really isn't that big, but most people are afraid to even speak up in a group of people. And I'm talking about adults, not just college students or kids. And so the more things that you take in, the more you avail yourself to what is out there. I mean, I have gone down the rabbit hole in YouTube, listening to music and going back and back and back and back into roots music and all of that, because there's amazing things you can find on there. Looking at films, going to galleries, all of these things put the little dots in your brain. And the more dots you have, the shorter the distance it is connecting those dots. So that the more that you know, the more that you can synthesize ideas and see these relationships between things that can create opportunities. So a real world example, back when I started in the production business, fashion shows, they were covered extensively with still photographers out front, but nobody was shooting the shows in motion. The designers are backstage during the shows, so they didn't see their own shows. They would rely on the stills, and their staff, 99% of them who are afraid to tell the truth to the person in power. And so, everybody loved it. Well, once you saw a film of the fashion show, you could see how the clothing moved on the model. You could see whether the audience was engaged or not. And you got a sense of the context, not just a single image. Plus, I saw that people were waiting in their showrooms to have their sales appointments. You could be playing these videos on monitors in the showrooms. So when buyers were there or press was there waiting to come in to talk about the collection, they could be watching the collection. And then moving that to point of purchase in the stores. I mean, you can't go into a store now that doesn't have monitors all over the place. But back when I started, there were none. Nobody was doing that. So I saw an opportunity, and I sort of telescoped that opportunity so that when I pitched a potential client early on, before it was common to be videoing fashion shows, and I talked to Halston, who was one of the top designers in the world at that time. And I said, Halston, how often do you see your own fashion show? He goes, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, do you ever see your own show? He goes, of course not. I'm backstage. So how do you know what really happened? How do you know the expressions on the audience's faces? How did you really get feedback? And he was sort of quizzed by that. And when I suggested to him that I shoot his fashion show, and here's all the additional uses so you can amortize the cost of doing it. He was a visionary guy and a very creative person himself, immediately saw the value. And then once I got him, I went to Ralph Lauren. So you also sell from who you've sold. So I sold Halston. I was able to present to Ralph the same thing. Ralph also very visionary and immediately got how this could be of benefit to him. So those are the ways that you can like put ideas together. First, inform yourself. And then when you inform yourself, and by the way, that's a lifelong process. It's not like you stop once you start getting busy with work and business. You know, I think that once, I guess the key word, Mike, is curiosity.
Right.
Because once your curiosity is lit up, you're engaged. And that's a great state of mind to be in.
Yeah.
And the worst people to be around are those who think they have all the answers and have no curiosity.
Yeah.
Those people, who wants to be around people like that?
Yeah,
no
exactly.
fun. You know, so I think that, you know, I hope that answers the question. I went on a bit, but that's how I see it in terms of giving yourself the opportunity to create those dots in the brain that can be connected so you can see multiple possibilities from things.
Yeah, I love that. I'm saying I love that a lot, but it's because it's true. I do love a lot of what you're saying. And the visual.
I love that you love that, Mike.
Yeah, good on it. I tell you what, if we weren't just on this video in the same room, we'd be doing a man hug right now. I'm quite sure of it. The visual of the dots, joining the dots, more dots than the shorter the distance between the dots, and the faster the picture is going to take shape. I really love that. I'm going to use that, actually. I'll credit you. But so.
Okay. Let me throw out one more thing about that, okay?
Please do.
You might find that interesting.
Yeah.
What happens is, you know, and I think what we all strive for, whether we know it or not, is an organizing principle. Okay, so my organizing principle when I was designing clothes was coming up with that narrative, right, for the collection that I was doing. The organizing principle when I started making films is, what is the story that I'm trying to tell? The story of a collection. So how did I develop my own style in shooting fashion? Well, how do you want to see fashion? You want to see it in motion, you know, because people wear it in life. They aren't posing, you know, when they're walking down the street. Some people are, but you know, you want to see it in motion. You want to see it like you'll see it. And so I think that, you know, an organizing principle, Lloyd Price's life, there was an organizing principle there, the conflicts that he had and obstacles that he had dealing with race, the music industry itself, the creative process of writing songs, all of these things that came together. So that was the organizing principle. So go way back in time now, and you look up at the stars, and you see all these flickering lights up there, and there's no Big Dipper. There's no Orion. It's a bunch of stars. But we're compelled as humans to put an order and a construct over things. And that's the organizing principle. You know, the organizing principle is how we see things so it makes sense to us. It's not only a critical part of the creative process, I think it's a critical part of life, because, you know, things don't intrinsically make sense. And we try to order that chaos into something that's understandable.
Excellent. Jeffrey Madoff has his book, Creative Careers, Making a Living with Your Ideas. You know, it could almost, for the purpose of our podcast, be creative careers, creative ideas, getting out of a rut. Because I think I haven't read the book. I didn't have time to get it delivered here in the Philippines before the interview. However, doing what most of us do, go to Amazon and open up inside and check. There it is. Thank you. Right on cue. That's the way. And let me just quote, thank you, Jeff. Beautifully done, mate. And let me just quote Jeff here. A picture is worth 1,000 words, and a video is 30 frames per second. So you get the idea of why, Jeff. By the way, I wanted to ask you something. Okay, so your creativity and production content for Ralph Lauren, you told the story about video. You created the concept of videoing fashion parades front of house so that the designers back of house could get a chance to see. Last year, podcasting, the use of audio medium, took off for many reasons. And also marketers have swarmed around this new platform, Clubhouse, as well. You would have noticed that because you've been around you're one of these mature-aged guys who have been around the internet and web content since its inception. So, what about? This has got nothing to do really per se about getting life back on track, but I'm interested in the technology side of things and your take on this. The future of video, as opposed to the future, say, in the next 5 years of audio. Do you have any thoughts on that, and any telescopic forecasts of if you think audio could replace video for consumption?
Well, we have historic examples: radio, and television. And so it's interesting because podcasts are basically radio on demand.
Right.
You can choose what you'll want to listen to, not only music with Spotify or Pandora or whatever, but also with podcasts, you can choose the subjects that you want to explore and people you'd like to listen to on all of that. And so the good thing about that is if you're taking a walk, if you're in your car, if you're at the gym, you can listen to podcasts or audiobooks or whatever, and, sort of keep the ideas going on that way. Hard to watch video during that, but most of the gyms, they've got monitors and you can be watching the screens, the TV screens, and doing that. What I think that's different is the method of delivery. Okay. And I don't think there's anything really new, but the method of delivery is different. So now we have options. If you're in New York and you're taking the subway or the bus, you can watch content on your phone. If you are not in a situation where you can watch because you're working out or you're driving or whatever, you can listen to that content. So I think that it's not an either or. I think it's an and.
Yes. Nicely answered. All right. Let's begin to wrap it up, Jeff. Time flies when you're having fun, and I've been having fun in this conversation with you. Plus, I've learned a few things. My radar has been elevated just by listening to you. I've enjoyed listening to your story of your earlier beginnings and how you began in the fashion industry, and the story you shared with us, the personal story of the downturn in the 1970s. The economy meant that you had to make some hard decisions, and how some mornings it felt like it was hard to even get out of bed. Here we are in 2021, and you're now sharing a story, and so that passed. And so the worst case scenario didn't eventuate. And you've got a couple of sons, I believe. Are they also entrepreneurs and in the fashion industry?
Well, I actually have a son and daughter that are twins.
Son and daughter.
Yes, and they both are entrepreneurs. However, it's interesting. They've sort of taken the best of both worlds because they both have built up a very significant client base with their freelance work. And they both have good jobs that are totally aligned with the same kind of freelance work they do. Perfect. So they have stability and benefits plus extra income being an entrepreneur.
And both of them graduates?
Pardon?
They're both college graduates?
My son is. My daughter opted out of school after her freshman year and wanted to pursue acting. And then she started doing graphic design and got so busy that she just decided she didn't need to go back.
Wonderful. Are they in their 30s?
27.
Okay. If finish off with, I think if there was a second word that comes to mind when I think of Jeff Madoff, creativity number one, story is the second word that comes to mind. You are a storyteller. In fact, you described yourself as a storyteller in an interview that I watched in preparation. And you used the phrase, you used a telescopic view. So you had a vision into the future when you were sharing the story about the videoing of the front of house fashion shows. When I'm having coaching conversations with people who feel stuck and want to get unstuck, we often start with talking about, you actually mentioned this in your book about the importance, in fact, you mentioned it in part, you start your book with the importance of vision. And vision is so important in people who are stuck in adversity, suffering, and want to get out and get moving and get towards something better than what has been. Creating a story of the vision, visualization. How do you have a knack? Do you have a secret? Do you have a way of being able to create a story in your mind that hasn't happened yet? How do you go about that?
Well, first of all, let me say that I am always skeptical of recipes for success because they don't exist. And I call that the myth of replication. So, there are books about the millionaire next door and, the habits of highly effective people and all of that, but you can't replicate that because there's so many differences between people and circumstance and timing and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can do best practices, be prepared, work hard, be alert, apply yourself, engage, all show up on time, all of those things, which are really good. I tend to think more in terms of story, in terms of what I'm doing. I think in terms of story and where I would like it to go. So I have a certain vision of that, but I don't articulate some full vision of it. It's, things kind of evolve as I learn about things and, things that I didn't know could happen. I mean, initially, by the way, I thought I would direct my play because I've directed talent for close to 40 years.
Right.
But I am smart enough to know what I don't know.
Mm.
And I don't know stage blocking. I don't know how to schedule and structure rehearsals around songs, choreography, stage blocking, all of that. If it were a film, could I do that? Yes, because I know how to do all that with a camera and move the camera and all of that kind of thing. So I was aware that, I had a certain vision, so to speak, that I was going to do that. But the more I learned, the more I realized for two reasons, that's not a good idea. One reason is the reason I told you is I didn't really know it well enough to do that. And the more important reason is if I didn't get an established director, the project wouldn't be taken seriously. So sometimes you have to realize what it takes to get something done.
Right.
I knew that it took having an excellent director who is known in the business so that I could also parlay that into both not only fundraising, but good people bring other good people into the project. I have a fantastic director, Sheldon Epps. He brought in a fantastic musical supervisor, Shelton Beckton. And, you find good people through other good people. And that's how you build not only successful collaborations, but a community among the people that are working on the project.
Wonderful.
And so that's how I do it. That vision is always changing. So I don't have some overarching vision, but I would suggest a question that your listeners ask themselves. Because I don't think most people ask themselves this question, or they ask it once they're well into middle age. And this is even with people that are incredibly successful. They may be emotionally stuck, but in terms of their business, they're prospering.
Yes.
But the question is, what is success to you? How do you define it for yourself? And, is it acquisition of things? Is it a certain income level? Is it a certain amount of free time? What is it? What does success look like to you? And for me, it's about feeling engaged in what I'm doing and enjoying the people I work with and the projects that I'm working on. And so when you define success, then you've got a target to aim for. And it doesn't mean that you can't tack one way or another as you're on that journey. But if you don't really have any idea of what it really is that would fulfill you, then you're just kind of untethered and you're looking for a paycheck. And I think that it's a really important self-examination a person should do. I was forced to do it much earlier in life because of my business and, the things that I was facing. Mm-hmm. I'm incredibly thankful, as difficult as it was, I'm incredibly thankful for the vision that forced me to have and the definitions that I had to create for myself. And that's been my compass since then.
we're incredibly grateful for that. I'm incredibly grateful that you've joined us and that I've had this opportunity to introduce you to the audience of the Comeback Coach podcast. I'd like now to direct you, hold up your book again, please, and show that title, show that cover image. There it is.
Thank you.
Oh, done perfectly too. Creative Careers, Making a Living with Your Ideas by D. Jeffrey Madoff. And that's available where all good books are sold, but more than likely you're going to go on Amazon and check it out and have a click on the cover and open it up and have a scan through the, you get an idea. It's a book that I'm adding to my I'm going to read in 2021 list. I'm an avid reader, Jeff, so I love reading, and I get the feeling you are too. Your measure of achievement, you said, is not how much money you've accumulated, but how happy am I, in an interview that you did. And I wrote that down because I thought, yeah, that is spot on. And you mentioned also that people could be feeling stuck, not because their business necessarily is going down the tube or some other tangibly measurable backslide, but emotionally stuck. So many high-flying, high-performing, high achievers that have got all the toys and the money in the bank and everything else, they get bored and they get emotionally stuck, and they do feel stuck. And so coming back from a setback doesn't necessarily mean bankruptcy or loss of relationship or loss of part of health. It can be other things as well. If we're out of time, and I wish we had more time, maybe sometime in the future when you're not busy, we can have another conversation. I'd love it if we could do that. And
me too.
Terrific, Jeff. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you. And thank you on behalf of our listeners to this podcast. And all the very best for your play, which, by the way, we hope that this is going to hit the stage in 2022. The title of the play again?
Personality, the Lloyd Price musical.
Yeah, we're going to look for that. And once we've finished this interview, this conversation, I'm going to go to YouTube and put in Lloyd Price and listen to some of his old tracks, just because I'm sure that my mother and father had Lloyd Price tracks playing on the kitchen transistor radio back in the 1960s when I was just a boy. Jeff, thanks again. Have a wonderful evening there in New York. And to you, the listener, and to the viewer of this podcast, I hope that you've gained. Just one idea is all you need. If something Jeff has said has triggered you to think, actually, if that's all that's happened, then you've got benefit from this conversation with Jeff Madoff. And the next thing, as Jeff said, is after thinking is to take action, because without action, your legs aren't going to swing over the side of the bed. You're going to sleep all day in the bed. So motion is meditation. Jeff, sayonara.
Thank you, Mike.